Welcome to our deep dive today into the work of G. Stanley Hall. Now, he was a really fascinating guy, a real trailblazer in psychology and education back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And what I think is so interesting is how his ideas, but adolescence, gender, and education, how those ideas stack up against what we think today, you know?
Yeah, no, you're right. His writings really do offer a unique window into how those concepts have evolved. And we have a really great collection of his work to explore today, from his book Adolescence, articles on education, even some personal reflections on his own life.
Wow, it's like a time capsule we're about to open.
Exactly.
Speaking of time capsules, his book Adolescence, that's where he introduced that now famous idea of storm and stress
Right.
as a hallmark of the teenage years.
Exactly. He believed that adolescence was inherently turbulent, marked by these intense physical and psychological changes. And he wasn't just theorizing,
Great.
he meticulously documented physical growth, going as far as to create really detailed charts showing how dramatically height and weight changed during those years.
Oh, yes, looking at those charts. And one thing that really jumped out at me was his finding that boys, they gain about half their strength after age 11. Just imagine that energy surge, like suddenly becoming a superhero.
It's a great analogy, and it makes sense when you consider what we know now about brain development during adolescence, the prefrontal cortex, that area responsible for things like decision-making and impulse control. That's still maturing during those years. So you have these, incredibly powerful physical and emotional changes happening. But the brain's ability to regulate all of that is still catching up.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Really, it seems like he was really on to something, even back then, about the unique challenges teenagers face. And this leads to, I think, another interesting aspect of his work, his strong advocacy for physical activity.
Absolutely. In his book Youth, he passionately argues for the importance of play, sports, even manual labor. For adolescent development, he saw these activities as outlets for all that energy. And he really believed that they contributed to physical and moral growth.
Right. So it's like the 1900s version of
Yeah.
encouraging kids to get off the screens and get some fresh air.
Yeah.
And of course, some of his ideas might seem a little old-fashioned today,
Right.
especially when it comes to gender roles.
Yeah, that's a really important point to keep in mind. We have to remember that Hall was writing in a time when societal expectations for boys and girls were vastly different.
For sure. And you can definitely see that in some of his statements about girls, particularly in educational problems. In youth, he talks about their passion for secrets, their different reading preferences compared to boys.
And it even suggests they have this migratory instinct tied to truancy.
Whoa. Yeah. Some of his ideas are a little bit startling to read today.
It is. But it's important to put his views in historical context.
Right.
Back then, societal norms often confined women to the domestic sphere.
Absolutely. And, while those views are definitely outdated, analyzing them, I think, it helps us understand how much our thinking about gender has changed. Yeah. Makes you wonder what Hall would make of the world today, with all the progress we've made in terms of gender equality and recognizing the spectrum of gender identities.
It would be fascinating to see his reaction,
Right.
wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Especially considering his thoughts on education for girls.
Yeah. In youth,
Yeah.
he tackles this head on. He really believed in providing girls with opportunities for intellectual growth, but he also stressed what he called ineradicable sex differences. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that idea of separate education for boys and girls?
It's a complex issue. Hall was grappling with this question of balancing opportunities while acknowledging the social context of his time. But today, our understanding of gender and its impact on learning has evolved significantly, We recognize the importance of creating inclusive educational environments that support the diverse needs and potential of all students.
That's a key difference for sure. But it's interesting to see how some of Hall's educational theories, particularly his emphasis on hands-on learning, still resonates with modern approaches.
Absolutely. In education during adolescence, he rails against rote memorization and standardized tests. He even calls required reading lists pedagogic decadence, which I find kind of amusing.
I love that.
Yeah.
And honestly, his criticism of those traditional methods feels so relevant today
Yeah.
to current debates,
Yeah.
around standardized testing and the push for more personalized learning experiences. It's like he was a century ahead of his time.
He was definitely ahead of the curve in many ways.
Yeah. And it wasn't just about teaching methods. He was also concerned about preparing young people for the changing demands
Right.
of the workforce.
Right.
Yeah. In youth, he strongly advocates for.
Yeah.
industrial education. He expresses worry about the international job market, what he calls a skills gap in America. Almost sounds like he's predicting the 21st century focus on STEM education and vocational training.
It's remarkable how his insights from over a century ago still hold true in many ways. His work really does offer this fascinating blend of progressive ideas intertwined with the social norms of his era.
It's fascinating. It makes me think about how our own ideas about education and development might seem to people 100 years from now.
Right.
What will they find insightful? And what will they find outdated?
That's an intriguing question to ponder.
It is.
Yeah. But for now, let's delve a little deeper into Hall's later writings, where he shifts his focus to aging and mortality.
Well, let's explore that part of his life.
Yeah.
And see what he had to say about those bigger questions.
It's really interesting how Hall's perspective on aging, how it was shaped by the time he lived in senescence, the last half of life. He mentions that he believed that. The average lifespan was much shorter back then.
Right. You're right. He even says, man still dies young, which is almost hard to believe.
Right.
Considering how much longer people live today.
It is.
It really highlights how our views on aging have shifted over time.
It does. And even back then, Hall was observing how the roles and perceptions of older adults were starting to change. But I think he would be amazed by the realities of aging populations today and this whole concept of retirement as we know it today.
Yeah, can you imagine Hall trying to wrap his head around retirement communities?
Yeah.
Or senior travel groups? I mean, it's a whole different world.
Absolutely.
But even with those differences, I wonder if his insights on the psychological and emotional aspects of aging, if they still hold up today.
I think they do in many ways. He explores those internal shifts that happen as we age. He even proposes this intriguing idea of a counter will to die emerging later in life.
What did he mean by that? That sounds a bit counterintuitive.
Yeah, he suggests that. As people fully experience the joys and sorrows of life, a different kind of acceptance, maybe even a readiness for death can develop. It's like having lived a full life, there's less of a struggle against the inevitable.
That's a really thought-provoking concept. It makes me wonder if, our modern-day focus on youth and longevity, maybe that's preventing us from fully embracing the later stages of life.
It's a really interesting point. Hall seemed to believe that each stage of life had its own unique value and purpose, and he really saw senescence, or old age, as a time for reflection, for wisdom, for a deeper understanding of the human experience.
I see what you mean. He wasn't viewing aging as a decline, but as another chapter in the story of life. It's a perspective I think we could all learn from today, especially in a culture that often prioritizes youth and vitality above everything else.
Absolutely. And this actually connects back to his work on adolescence in a kind of unexpected way. While Hall didn't use the term emotional intelligence,
Right.
His emphasis on understanding and managing those intense emotions of youth aligns with what we now know about, developing healthy coping mechanisms and building resilience.
Oh, that's a really interesting connection.
Yeah.
It's almost like he was laying the groundwork for understanding the complexities of mental health, even though that field was still in its infancy back then.
You could say that, yeah. His observations about social and psychological challenges that teenagers face, those resonate with contemporary concerns about mental health in young people, and his focus on physical activity, play, and creative expression. That aligns with many therapeutic approaches used today to support teens' well-being.
It's really remarkable how so many of these themes, they seem to connect back to each other. So we're seeing this bigger picture of human development unfold.
I agree.
Through Hall's work.
Yeah.
Now, before we move on, I want to circle back to something that Hall said in Youth that really stuck with me. He claims that man still dies young, meaning that even in his time, he felt people weren't fully experiencing the later stages of life.
That's right.
And he goes on to suggest that if we lived longer and truly embraced old age, we might develop a counter will to die.
It's a provocative idea.
It is. It almost makes you wonder if our fear of death and our desire for immortality stem from the fact that we haven't fully explored the potential of old age.
It's a really fascinating thought, He's challenging us to reframe our perspective on aging.
Right.
What if instead of seeing it as a decline, we saw it as a natural, potentially fulfilling stage of life?
Yes. That's a really powerful message.
It is.
Especially in a society that so often equates youth with value.
And it really speaks to Hall's belief
Yeah.
that every stage of life holds its own unique significance. And he saw senescence as a time for reflection, for wisdom, and for, deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
It makes you wonder what he would have thought about the impact of technology on development, especially in young people.
Yeah.
Here we are over a century later, grappling with how smartphones, social media, constant connectivity, how all that is shaping the way young minds develop and experience the world.
That's such a relevant question. It's hard to say for certain, but I imagine Hall would be both fascinated and maybe a little overwhelmed by the world we live in today, with the rapid technological advancements, the interconnectedness of everything, the awareness of social and environmental issues. It's a lot to take in. But I also believe that he would be inspired by the energy and idealism of young people today and their commitment to shaping a better future.
I agree. And while, Hall may not have all the answers,
Right.
I think his work gives us a valuable framework for thinking about human development.
Mm.
And the role of education, he reminds us that adolescence is a time of incredible potential,
Yes.
but also vulnerability.
Yeah.
And that, to nurture that potential, we need a deep understanding of the forces that shape young lives, the physical,
Yeah.
the emotional, the social.
Yes. Absolutely. And his work reminds us that while the specific challenges may change the fundamental questions about human development, social influence, and the search for meaning and purpose, those remain constant.
I think that's a really important takeaway from our deep dive into Hall's work.
I agree. His writings really offer a timeless perspective on the complexities of human experience, even as the world around us continues to change.
It's amazing how, even though Hall was writing over 100 years ago, his observations about adolescence, they still resonate with us today. He really was the first to put a spotlight on this period of life as its own distinct phase, with all its unique psychological and social dynamics.
Absolutely. Before Hall, adolescence was often viewed as just a transition, between childhood and adulthood. But he argued that it was a period of profound transformation and deserved to be studied in its own right.
Right, and that shift in thinking has had a huge impact on how we approach education, parenting, even our understanding of mental health.
You're exactly right. His insights on the emotional intensity of adolescence, the search for identity, the influence of peers, those are all still relevant today, even as the cultural landscape has evolved.
Yeah, one thing that really struck me as we were going through his work was how interconnected he saw everything.
Yeah.
Didn't view physical, emotional, and social development as separate things. He saw them as, intertwined threads that shape who we become.
That's a really important takeaway from Hall's work, that holistic view of development. It's a reminder that we can't truly understand any stage of life without considering the interplay of all those different dimensions.
Now, as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of G. Stanley Hall, I want to leave our listeners with a final question to ponder. It's something that he wrestled with throughout his life, and it's a question that continues to challenge us today. How can we best prepare young people for the challenges and opportunities of a world that's constantly changing?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think Hall would be both fascinated and maybe a little overwhelmed by the world we live in today. The rapid technological advancements, the interconnectedness of everything, the awareness of social and environmental issues. It's a lot to take in. But I also believe that he would be inspired by the energy and idealism of young people today and their commitment to shaping a better future.
I agree.
Right.
And while Hall may not have all the answers, I think his work gives us a valuable framework for thinking about human development and the role of education.
Right.
He reminds us that adolescence is a time of incredible potential, but also vulnerability. And to nurture that potential, we need a deep understanding of the forces that shape young lives, the physical, the emotional,
the social. Absolutely. And, his spirit of inquiry, his passion for understanding the human experience, and his belief in the power of young people to make a difference in the world. I think those are all things we can carry with us.
Well said. Well, thanks for joining us on this journey into the fascinating world of G. Stanley Hall.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We hope you've enjoyed it, and maybe it sparked some new ideas or questions for you to explore. Until next time,